In a genuinely good year for the market, someone with $100,000 invested can see their portfolio grow by more than most people are able to save from their paycheck in an entire year of disciplined saving. Not the contribution, not the deposit, just the growth, sitting there, happening whether you check your account or not. That's the moment everything changes, and it's not the same moment as the one everyone talks about. I made an entire video about the $50,000 threshold, the point where your portfolio's own growth starts contributing close to as much as your monthly contributions do. $100,000 is not just a bigger version of that same milestone. It's a completely different psychological threshold, and almost nobody explains why the two feel so different even though they're only $50,000 apart. I'm Ellie. I make videos about the exact moments in your financial life when things quietly shift, even when nobody's throwing a party for it. If you've crossed $100,000 invested and felt strangely underwhelmed, or you're approaching it and wondering what's actually supposed to change, stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's different this time. Hit subscribe if that sounds useful. Let's get into it. Here's the thesis of this entire video. At $50,000, your portfolio's growth becomes comparable to your contributions. At $100,000, your portfolio's growth becomes large enough, in raw dollars, to fund real decisions on its own. A wedding, a down payment cushion, a sabbatical in a single good year. That's not a difference of degree. It's a difference of kind, and it changes how the account needs to be managed, not just how big the number looks. Let's make this concrete. At $50,000 invested, a strong year, say a 14% return, adds about $7,000. Meaningful, but still roughly comparable to a year of disciplined contributions for most people. At $100,000, that same 14% year adds $14,000, and here's the part that matters. $14,000 is now larger than what most people can save from their take-home pay in an entire year, even with real discipline. The portfolio isn't just growing faster in percentage terms because the percentage hasn't changed at all. It's that the same percentage now produces a dollar amount large enough to functionally replace a full year of saving, something that simply wasn't mathematically possible at $50,000. This works in the other direction too, and it's the part almost nobody prepares for. A rough year, say a 12% decline, costs about $6,000 at $50,000 invested. At $100,000, that same 12% decline costs $12,000. Same percentage drop, double the dollar amount, and this is where the psychology at $100,000 starts to diverge sharply from $50,000, because $12,000 disappearing in a bad stretch is enough to cover a real financial goal, which makes the loss feel like it erased something specific and tangible, not just a number on a screen. There's a second, quieter shift that happens around this same threshold, and it's worth naming directly because it explains a lot of what happens next. Below $100,000, most people mentally file their investment account as a version of savings, a slightly riskier place to put money that's still fundamentally the same category as a savings account, just with more upside. Above $100,000, the account starts to feel like something else entirely. A second financial identity, a thing that has its own trajectory, somewhat independent of your paycheck. This isn't irrational. The dollar amounts genuinely start behaving that way, capable of moving by thousands of dollars in a single week, regardless of anything happening in your actual working life. But this shift in how the account feels is exactly what sets up the mistake that shows up in almost everyone who crosses this threshold without preparing for it. Why $100,000 specifically, rather than $75,000 or $150,000? Partly it's genuinely mathematical. This is roughly the point where a typical strong or weak year starts moving the account by an amount that matches or exceeds a full year of contributions for the median investor. But partly it's psychological in a way that has nothing to do with math at all. Round numbers carry weight that nearby numbers don't. $94,000 and $106,000 are, in every practical sense, nearly identical amounts of money. But crossing from $99,000 to $101,000 feels like crossing a threshold in a way that $94,000 to $96,000 never does, purely because of how the human brain processes round milestones. This matters here because it means the psychological shift often arrives right around the same time as the mathematical one, reinforcing each other and making the transition feel more sudden than it actually is. Let's meet two investors at exactly this threshold. Derek and Amara both just crossed $100,000, invested within the same month, both contributing $500 monthly, both using the same simple index fund. Same starting point. What happens over the following year is where they diverge, not because of different investment choices, but because of a completely different relationship with the number itself. Derek started checking his portfolio daily almost immediately after crossing $100,000, something he'd never done at $50,000 or below. It felt natural, almost responsible, like a milestone that deserved more attention. Within the first few months, the market moved through a normal stretch of volatility, up 2% one week, down 3% the next, ordinary movement for any given quarter. But at $100,000, 2% is $2,000 and 3% is $3,000. And watching those swings daily, in dollar terms rather than percentage terms, created a level of anxiety Derek had never experienced at smaller account sizes, even though the underlying volatility of the fund itself hadn't changed at all. By month 4, that anxiety led to a specific decision. After a rough 2-week stretch that took the account down about $4,000, roughly $30,000 of his $100,000+ portfolio, Derek moved into cash, reasoning that he needed to protect what he'd built, after finally crossing a milestone that felt significant. The market recovered over the following 6 weeks, gaining back roughly 6%, and Derek's $30,000 sitting in cash missed that recovery entirely, costing him approximately $1,800 in gains he would have captured had he simply left the allocation alone. Amara crossed the same $100,000 threshold the same month, with the identical $500 monthly contribution and the same index fund. She made one specific decision early. She reduced how often she checked her account from daily to once a month, coinciding with her contribution date, specifically because she recognized that daily dollar amount swings at this size would feel different than they had at $50,000, even though nothing about the underlying risk had actually changed. When the same volatile stretch hit her portfolio, she experienced it once, retroactively, as a single monthly data point rather than as a sequence of daily gains and losses. And by the time she checked again, the recovery had already happened, folded into a single, far less emotionally charged number. Here's what that actually looked like in practice for Amara, since check less often can sound vague without a concrete picture. On her monthly check-in date, she opened her account, saw a number that reflected the net result of the entire volatile stretch already resolved, glanced at it for perhaps 90 seconds, confirmed her automatic contribution had processed, and closed the app. There was no moment where she watched the account drop by $3,000 in a single afternoon and had to sit with that feeling, because that specific afternoon simply wasn't a data point she ever saw in isolation. By month 9, a second rough week hit the market, and Derek, having already reestablished his full position after the first incident, repeated a smaller version of the same pattern, moving 15% of his portfolio to cash after a single bad week, missing a shorter, but still costly partial recovery over the following month. 1 year later, Derek's portfolio, despite the identical starting point, identical contributions, and identical underlying fund, trails Amara's by more than the $1,800 he lost in the first cash out, because that missed recovery compounded over the following months, and because the second, smaller version of the same pattern added its own separate cost on top. Here's the mistake underneath both of Derek's decisions, and it's specific to this exact dollar threshold. Below $100,000, checking your account daily costs you very little, because the dollar swings are small enough that daily monitoring doesn't create much emotional pressure to act. Above $100,000, the exact same daily checking habit starts generating dollar-sized swings large enough to feel like they demand a response, even when the underlying percentage volatility is completely unchanged. The habit that was harmless at $50,000 becomes actively costly at $100,000, not because the habit changed, but because what it's now measuring changed. This isn't just an intuition either. There's a well-documented behavioral finance concept called myopic loss aversion, first described by researchers Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler in the mid-1990s, which found that investors who evaluate their portfolios more frequently are more likely to observe a loss, become more anxious about that risk, and consequently make worse long-term decisions than investors who check less often. The math behind why is straightforward. Using historical S&P 500 data, there's roughly a 47% chance the market is down on any single given day, but that probability drops to around 38% when you're looking at a full month's return instead. Checking daily doesn't just feel worse. It statistically shows you more losses than checking monthly does on the exact same underlying investment. Here's the objection that probably came up somewhere in the last few minutes because it comes up for almost everyone hearing this for the first time. Doesn't checking less often just mean being less responsible with a larger sum of money? It's worth answering directly because the instinct feels reasonable, even though it points the wrong way. Checking frequency and responsibility are not the same thing. Amara's underlying strategy, a diversified index fund with a consistent monthly contribution, required exactly 0 daily decisions to remain sound. There was nothing to actively manage on a daily basis that checking more often would have improved. The only thing daily checking added was more opportunities to observe short-term noise and mistake it for a signal requiring action. Responsible investing at this size looks like a stable, appropriate allocation checked on a predictable schedule, not vigilance for its own sake. Derek wasn't being more responsible by checking daily. He was giving himself more chances to talk himself into a mistake. This is the actual practical shift that happens after $100,000 invested, and it's the opposite of what most people expect. It's not about needing a more sophisticated strategy, or diversifying differently, or checking more closely to manage a bigger number. It's about deliberately checking less, specifically because your emotional response to dollar-sized swings hasn't caught up to the new scale of the account, and won't until you build in a structural distance between yourself and the daily number. If you're approaching or have just crossed $100,000 invested, here's what to actually do differently. Set a specific infrequent checking schedule. Monthly is a reasonable default, ideally tied to a routine event like your contribution date, rather than an arbitrary calendar reminder. Turn off any daily balance notifications from your brokerage app specifically, since those notifications are calibrated to alert you to percentage moves that used to be dollar insignificant and no longer are. And if you do check during a downturn, remind yourself explicitly that the percentage volatility of your fund hasn't changed just because you crossed a threshold, only the dollar amount that percentage now represents. $50,000 was about your portfolio's growth becoming comparable to your contributions. $100,000 is about your portfolio's swings becoming large enough to trigger decisions that actively work against you, unless you deliberately change your relationship with how often you look. The math didn't get harder at this level. The psychology did, and that's the part nobody puts on a milestone chart. If this reframed how you think about this stage of your money, hit like and subscribe for more of the numbers nobody hands you up front.